Henry VIII started out as a strong, tall, and athletic king. In his younger days, he was known for his good looks, charm, and energy. But by the time he reached the 1540s, everything had changed. Henry had grown extremely large, weighing over 300 pounds. He suffered from several health problems like painful leg ulcers, gout, and the effects of overeating, especially meat. He could no longer ride horses, climb stairs, or even walk without help. His legs were so badly infected that people said you could smell him before he even entered the room. The ulcers were so deep, they sometimes showed bone. Doctors tried everything they could think of at the time: honey herbs, burning the wounds shut, but nothing really worked. His legs leaked pus and smelled terrible. This made it hard for anyone to be around him, even his own servants and doctors. Despite his terrible condition, Henry still wanted to look powerful. Painters made portraits of him looking strong and full of life. But the truth was, he was rotting behind the royal clothing. He had become a prisoner of his own body. Henry's diet didn't help. He ate huge meals filled with meat, swans, deer, lamb, game birds, and more. He drank gallons of red wine every day. Vegetables and fruits were rare on his table unless they were used for decoration. His meals weren't just large, they were massive, feeding his household as well as his ego. As he grew heavier, his digestion got worse. His doctors noted that he often had bloating and made loud groaning sounds after meals. Toward the end of his life, even chewing became difficult. His teeth were rotting, but he still insisted on huge feasts. Food had to be cut up for him, and lifting a turkey leg took real effort. At this point, gravity was clearly winning. Moving him required teams of attendants, ropes, and special chairs built just to hold his weight. He couldn't walk and had to be wheeled around or lifted by cranes just to get on a horse. His body was failing fast, and his moods grew worse. He had fits of anger, fired people for small reasons, and became unpredictable. He'd cry over his late wife Jane Seymour one moment, then order someone's death the next. Living in his court was like walking on eggshells. Servants and advisors had to watch his moods carefully to avoid being punished. The smell from his ulcers became so bad that people backed away from him when he entered a room. In Tudor England, bathing wasn't common, but even by those standards, Henry's body odor was intense. His clothes were burned after use because they couldn't be cleaned. He used powders and perfumes to try to hide it, but nothing worked. His legs were constantly wrapped, but they still leaked and caused infections. As Henry became more isolated and angry, people started to fear him more than ever. Even his doctors wouldn't tell him the truth about his health. It was illegal to say the king was dying, so everyone pretended he was just resting or reflecting. In reality, he was bedridden, surrounded by pillows and paperwork. He signed documents and made changes to his will, but it was clear to everyone that he was near the end. Yet Henry refused to admit he was dying. Priests asked if he wanted to confess or make peace with God, but he avoided the question. Some say he whispered, "All is lost," but no one knew if he meant his kingdom, his soul, or just a misplaced piece of meat. When Henry finally died in January 1547, no one in the room dared say it out loud. Declaring the king dead without official permission was considered treason, so everyone stood in silence, pretending he was still alive. His body remained in the palace while advisors quietly made plans for his 9-year-old son Edward to become king. But the biggest problem now was the body itself. Henry was so large, infected, and unwell that his corpse began to decay quickly. They tried to embalm him using spices and cloth, but it wasn't enough. The coffin started leaking dark fluid, and during the funeral procession, it gave off such a strong odor that even the horses were startled. At one stop, dogs were seen licking the fluid leaking from the coffin. It was a shocking end for someone who had once ruled England with so much power. In the end, Henry wasn't buried in a grand tomb like other kings. Instead, he was laid to rest in a quiet chapel next to Jane Seymour, the wife who gave him a male heir and died before she could disappoint him. His grave didn't even have a name on it for over 100 years. For a man who changed the face of religion in England and ruled with such force, Henry VIII's final years were filled with pain, decay, and silence. He had once been a powerful prince, but he died as a sick, rotting man surrounded by people too afraid to speak the truth. His legacy lives on, but so does the memory of how badly his body and mind fell apart at the end. When Henry VIII finally died on January 28, 1547, it didn't happen with fanfare or royal speeches. There was no big announcement. In fact, it was illegal to say the king had died without official approval. Under Tudor law, even suggesting that the monarch was dead could be considered treason. So, instead of mourning openly, everyone in the room pretended he was just sleeping very deeply and very permanently. The people closest to him, doctors, advisors, priests, just stood there in silence, waiting for someone else to make the first move. No one wanted to be the one to say, "The king is dead." They agreed to keep it secret for a few days while they made sure his 9-year-old son Edward would take the throne without trouble. During this time, Henry's body stayed at Whitehall Palace. Although he was no longer alive, he was still the king. In name, ministers quietly handled his affairs and prepared for his funeral, all while pretending everything was fine. The smell of decay was starting to spread, but no one dared talk about it. Now came a new problem: what to do with the king's body. Henry VIII wasn't just any man, he was huge, sick, and filled with infections. His body began breaking down, much faster than expected. They tried to preserve him by stuffing the body with spices and wrapping it in cloth. This was the best embalming they had at the time, but it didn't work well. Soon, the coffin began to leak, first slowly, then noticeably. A dark, stinking fluid started seeping out, and no one could ignore it. Even during the funeral procession, the smell was so bad it shocked the horses. One infamous story says dogs started licking the fluid dripping from the coffin. That's right, the body of the head of the Church of England was oozing through his coffin, and dogs were eating it. It's a moment that stuck in people's memories for centuries, and it got worse. The coffin hadn't been sealed properly. Gas built up inside from the decay, and the pressure caused it to crack open. At one stop, Sion Abbey, the black fluid leaking out was so disgusting and shocking that people were horrified. Some say it was a sign from God, a punishment for Henry's cruelty. Others just saw it as the sad end of a king who once ruled with strength, now melting inside a wooden box. But the show had to go on. The nobles walking beside the coffin pretended they couldn't smell anything. No one talked about the leak. They just wiped the coffin, straightened their clothes, and kept walking. The smell followed them, but no one dared mention it. Finally, Henry's body was taken to Windsor Castle. You might think that a king like Henry, who changed the entire religion of England, would be buried in a grand tomb like Westminster Abbey. But he wasn't. Instead, he was buried in a quiet vault under the floor of St. George's Chapel, almost like an afterthought. He was buried next to Jane Seymour, the only one of his 6 wives to give him a son. She had died shortly after childbirth, so he never had a chance to turn on her like he had with the others. For over a century, there was no name on his grave. No statue, no monument, just a plain slab on the floor. Visitors walked right over it without knowing he was there. It wasn't until the Victorian era, hundreds of years later, that someone added an inscription. Until then, the most powerful king in English history had been lying in an unmarked grave, quietly forgotten by time. The man who had once broken away from the Catholic Church and declared himself head of the Church of England ended up buried like a moderately successful merchant. It's hard not to see the irony. After years of war, executions, 6 marriages, and massive political changes, Henry VIII ended up alone in the ground, remembered more for his legs, his wives, and his eating habits than for his achievements. He had planned a grand tomb for himself for decades, but it was never finished. And maybe that's fitting. Henry was always trying to control everything: his country, his church, even his image. But in the end, he couldn't control death. He couldn't control decay. And he couldn't control how history would remember him. Valeria Messalina was born into one of Rome's most powerful families. She was connected to emperors like Tiberius and Nero. From a young age, she learned that life in Roman high society wasn't about being kind or fair, it was about surviving. Power, appearances, and secrets were everything. In a world full of backstabbing and lies, Messalina learned quickly how to play the game as a teenager. She married her cousin Claudius, who at the time was seen as a harmless, awkward man. Claudius had physical disabilities and wasn't expected to become emperor, but when his nephew Caligula was assassinated, Claudius was suddenly made the new ruler of Rome. That made Messalina, still in her early 20s, the empress. Most expected her to be a quiet wife, but Messalina had other plans. Behind her beauty was a sharp mind. She wanted more than just a title, she wanted real power. She didn't sit in the background. Instead, she got involved in politics, advised Claudius, and made secret moves to strengthen her own position. She made friends, formed alliances, and used fear and charm to get what she wanted. She became famous not just for her influence, but for something more scandalous. Roman historians wrote that Messalina had a huge appetite for sex and power. They claimed she snuck out at night and secretly worked at a brothel, competing with prostitutes and returning home before morning. Whether these stories were true or just meant to shame her is still debated, but the rumors made her even more famous. Many of her lovers were not just random men, they were powerful senators and noblemen. By seducing them, Messalina gained influence and control. If she liked you, she might help your career. If you upset her, you could lose everything or worse. Some people ended up exiled or executed simply for getting on her bad side. While Claudius worked on laws and government, Messalina built a private empire of secrets and threats. She used lies to destroy people. If she wanted someone gone, all she had to do was accuse them of treason or adultery. Claudius, distracted or trusting, often believed her and signed off on their punishment. She also gave Claudius a son, Britannicus. That made her even more powerful. As the mother of the future emperor, few people dared to challenge her. Even Claudius's closest advisors were afraid to say anything against her. But behind all the glamour, her enemies were watching and waiting. Messalina didn't notice that the web of lies and danger she had spun was beginning to fall apart. The more people she stepped on to rise higher, the more enemies she made. Even some of her old allies began whispering that she was becoming reckless and dangerous. Her downfall began when she went too far. She started a relationship with a handsome and powerful senator named Gaius Silius. But this was no secret affair. Messalina reportedly married Silius in a public ceremony, even though she was still married to Emperor Claudius. And no one could believe it. Was she trying to replace Claudius as emperor? Was Silius planning to take the throne? It was the boldest move of her life, and it would be her last. One of Claudius's most trusted servants, a man named Narcissus, found out. Narcissus had been loyal for years, helping manage letters and decisions behind the scenes. But this betrayal was too big to ignore. He knew Claudius often acted slowly, so Narcissus made a bold move himself. He gathered evidence, warned the Imperial Guard, and exposed the plot before Messalina or Silius could make their next move. When Claudius was told about the secret marriage, he didn't believe it at first. But the evidence was clear. The woman he loved and trusted had betrayed him in the worst possible way. For the first time in his rule, Claudius acted quickly. He ordered the guards to arrest Silius and other supporters. They were executed without trial. Messalina, now truly in danger, ran to the gardens and begged for a chance to speak to Claudius. She believed he might forgive her, he always had before. But this time, Claudius wasn't listening. Narcissus feared Claudius might change his mind, so he sent a soldier with a message. Messalina had two options: kill herself or be dragged through the city in shame. Terrified, she tried to take her own life, but couldn't do it. In the end, the soldier had to do it for her. The empress who had ruled Rome through whispers and secrets died in a garden, alone and afraid. Her body was buried without honor, and her name was removed from official records. Her statues were taken down. Her memory was erased, at least officially. But Rome never really forgot Messalina even after her death. The city couldn't stop talking about her. Some said she cried and begged to the end. Others said she cursed Claudius as she died. Stories of her final moments spread like wildfire. She became a ghost in Rome's memory, a symbol of female ambition, scandal, and downfall. Claudius, shocked and embarrassed, began to clean house. He fired officials who had been close to Messalina and distanced himself from anyone linked to her. Only one person remained untouched: her son, Britannicus. Claudius still hoped the boy would one day rule, but the world was already changing again, and other people had their eyes on the throne. After Messalina's death, Emperor Claudius found himself in a dangerous position. He was without a wife, his court was full of power-hungry rivals, and his young son Britannicus was now a symbol of a fallen dynasty. Rome needed a new empress, someone to bring order, but also someone Claudius could trust. That's when Agrippina the Younger stepped in. Agrippina was no ordinary Roman woman. She came from a powerful family. Her father was Germanicus, her brother had been Emperor Caligula, and her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, had royal blood. She was smart, ambitious, and very careful. Unlike Messalina, who ruled with emotion and risk, Agrippina ruled with strategy and planning. Agrippina saw an opportunity. She convinced Claudius that marrying her would restore strength and dignity to the empire. She offered loyalty and the promise of a stable household. Even though they were related, she was his niece. The Senate passed a special law allowing them to marry. Just like that, Agrippina became empress. But she didn't stop there. From the moment she entered the palace, Agrippina began removing anyone who had supported Messalina. Her goal was simple: erase Messalina's memory and make sure Britannicus would never become emperor. She filled important positions with people loyal to her. She had her enemies exiled or quietly removed, and she worked hard to raise her son Nero into a future ruler. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero officially. That gave Nero a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar, and a claim to the throne as strong as Britannicus's. Nero received royal titles and honors. He even married Claudius's daughter, his stepsister, which further strengthened his position. Meanwhile, young Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius and Messalina, was being pushed aside. Agrippina made sure he was watched closely. His allies were removed. His tutors were replaced. Even his movements were restricted. He was still officially the heir, but now he was treated more like a prisoner. As Nero grew older, Claudius grew weaker. Agrippina's control of the palace increased. Some say she manipulated Claudius completely, turning him into a puppet. Others believe he simply gave up, trying to resist her. Either way, Claudius no longer acted with independence. Agrippina was the real power in Rome. Then, something strange happened. Claudius died suddenly. Some historians believe it was a natural death. Others are convinced that Agrippina poisoned him, perhaps using poison mushrooms, a favorite Roman method. Either way, the result was clear. Nero became emperor at the age of 16, with Agrippina as the most powerful woman in Rome. Britannicus, still a teenager, now posed a serious threat to Nero's rule. People in Rome knew he was the rightful heir. Some whispered that he should be on the throne instead. Agrippina and Nero knew this too, and they acted quickly. At a dinner banquet, Britannicus suddenly collapsed and died. The official story was that he had epilepsy, but many believed it was poison. Most historians agree that Nero had him killed to secure his throne once and for all. With Britannicus gone, Agrippina had completed her mission. Messalina's legacy was erased, and her own son sat on the throne. But her power was built on fear and manipulation, and it wouldn't last forever. Agrippina expected to control Nero as she had Claudius. But Nero was not a boy anymore, and he had his own ambitions. When Nero became emperor at just 16 years old, most people expected him to be a puppet. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had done everything to put him on the throne, removing her rivals, poisoning Claudius as many believe, and pushing her own son ahead of the rightful heir, Britannicus. First, Agrippina ruled through Nero. She sat beside him during important meetings, gave him advice, and made key decisions behind the scenes. The Roman people were shocked to see an empress with so much influence. Statues showed her standing next to Nero as an equal, something unheard of for a woman in ancient Rome. But Nero was growing up, and he didn't like sharing power. He began to resist his mother's control. As he became more confident, he pushed her away little by little. Agrippina, used to being in charge, didn't take this well. She started reminding Nero that she had made him emperor and could replace him if needed. That only made him more paranoid. Nero began forming his own court, surrounding himself with flatterers, artists, and young advisors who encouraged his worst instincts. He stopped listening to Agrippina and started listening to people who told him what he wanted to hear. Agrippina tried to fight back. Some sources say she threatened to support another candidate for emperor. Others claim she tried to influence Nero's love life, getting jealous when he fell for women she didn't approve of. The power struggle between mother and son grew tense and dangerous. Finally, Nero decided he'd had enough. According to ancient accounts, he came up with a plan to kill his own mother. His first attempt was almost theatrical. He invited Agrippina onto a specially built boat that was designed to collapse in the middle of the sea. The idea was that it would look like an accident, but Agrippina, a clever and tough woman, survived. She swam to shore and made it home. Now, she knew the truth. Her son wanted her dead. Nero was humiliated. His quiet plan had failed, and now Agrippina was alive and angry. He couldn't take the risk again. This time, he sent assassins to her villa. According to legend, when the killers came, Agrippina told them to stab her in the womb, the place where Nero had come from. It was a dark, symbolic moment. Her death shocked Rome. Even in a violent empire, killing your own mother was a terrible act. Nero tried to pretend it had been suicide or necessary for national security, but few people believed him. With Agrippina gone, Nero was now completely in control, but the price was high. Many historians say that killing his mother changed Nero forever. He became more paranoid, more cruel, and more obsessed with his own image. At first, Nero focused on art, music, and drama. He fancied himself a great actor and musician. He performed in public, a strange and scandalous thing for an emperor. He spent huge amounts of money on entertainment and personal luxuries. His court turned into a playground for the rich and shameless. But Rome itself began to suffer. Government was ignored. Tax money was wasted. And anyone who opposed Nero disappeared. He used secret trials, spies, and public executions to keep power. Even powerful senators lived in fear. The most famous event of Nero's reign was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The city burned for several days, and much of it was destroyed. Rumors spread that Nero had started the fire himself so he could rebuild the city in his own image. Some said he stood on a rooftop and played music while it burned. To shift blame, Nero accused the Christians, then a small and unpopular group, of starting the fire. He ordered brutal punishments. Many were tortured and killed in public. This started one of the first major persecutions of Christians in Roman history. VIII. Nero was seen as a mad emperor, talented in the arts, maybe, but dangerous and unstable. His relationships grew worse. He divorced and even killed his wife Poppaea by kicking her during a rage. He turned on his advisors and even on the generals who helped him stay in power. Nero believed he was loved by the people, but in truth, even the common citizens began to turn against him. His empire was falling apart, and rebellion was brewing. In 68 AD, a revolt finally broke out. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. Alone and afraid, he fled Rome. With no one left to help him, Nero took his own life. His final words were said to be, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family line that had ruled since Julius Caesar. The empire went into chaos, but the story of Nero and of the mother he destroyed to keep power would be remembered forever. When people think of the founding fathers of America, they often imagine noble, serious men writing laws, giving speeches, and building a new nation based on freedom. And while that's true to some extent, the full story is more complicated. Behind the public image of greatness were messy private lives filled with affairs, secret families, jealous rivalries, and big moral contradictions. Let's start with Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was a brilliant man. He helped design America's financial system and co-wrote the Federalist Papers. He worked closely with George Washington and became the first Secretary of the Treasury. But in 1791, While married and serving in high government office, Hamilton made a huge mistake. He began an affair with a young woman named Maria Reynolds. Maria came to his home claiming she had been abandoned by her husband and needed help. Hamilton gave her money. Soon after, the two started a secret relationship. But it wasn't just a personal affair, it turned into a political scandal. Maria's husband, James Reynolds, found out and used the affair to blackmail Hamilton. He demanded payments to keep quiet. For over a year, Hamilton secretly paid James Reynolds to hide what had happened. But in politics, secrets don't stay hidden for long. By 1797, his enemies began to spread rumors that Hamilton had not only had an affair, but had used government money to pay hush money. That would have been corruption. To defend himself, Hamilton did something shocking. He wrote a 95-page public confession known as the Reynolds pamphlet. In it, he admitted to the affair in detail, but insisted he had used only his own money, not public funds. The pamphlet stunned the public. Hamilton's political career never fully recovered, but his honesty about his mistake helped protect his reputation for financial integrity. He chose to be remembered as an adulterer rather than a thief. Next, there's Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States. Jefferson wrote about freedom, equality, and human rights. But he also owned hundreds of enslaved people at his home, Monticello, and among them was a woman named Sally Hemings. Sally was not only enslaved, she was also the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife. Historians believe Jefferson began a relationship with her when she was just 14 years old, and he was in his 40s, likely during his time in France. For years, people dismissed the rumors, but in the 1990s, DNA testing confirmed that Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Sally Hemings's children. Jefferson never freed Sally, but he quietly freed all of her surviving children. He never spoke publicly about them, never named them in writing. Yet his records show that Sally's pregnancies always matched the times he was at Monticello. It was a private life full of silence and contradictions. Jefferson, the man who wrote, "All men are created equal," owned people, kept a secret family, and made no effort to explain or defend it. His defenders claimed he was a man of morals, but his actions told a different story. Today, many see Jefferson as a brilliant thinker, but also someone who lived with deep hypocrisy. Now, let's look at Benjamin Franklin. Franklin is often remembered as the fun one among the founding fathers. He was an inventor, writer, and diplomat. He helped discover electricity, wrote witty sayings in Poor Richard's Almanac, and charmed the French during the American Revolution. But Franklin also had a mysterious and wild personal life. While in Europe, especially in England and France, Franklin spent a lot of time in secret societies and clubs, including the Hellfire Club, known for wild parties and a love of shocking behavior. He was popular with women, even into old age, and had many romantic relationships outside of marriage. Some of his letters suggest he believed older women made better lovers because they were more grateful and discreet. Franklin also had an unusual habit of using fake names when writing. He created characters like Silence Dogood and Polly Baker to publish essays that made fun of religion, government, and social rules. He didn't like being told what to believe and often used humor to challenge authority. Though he was brilliant and ahead of his time in many ways, Franklin wasn't very faithful to his wife, Deborah. He spent many years living apart from her, especially while in Europe. Some historians even believe he may have had children abroad, though there's no proof. Franklin supported freedom and independence, but he was also fascinated by secrets, codes, and hidden lives. He wasn't just a scientist or a statesman. He was a man full of contradictions, charming, clever, and not always what he seemed. These three men, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Franklin, helped shape the future of America, but they were far from perfect. They built a new nation based on ideas like liberty and justice, yet their personal choices often clashed with those values. They had affairs, kept secrets, and in Jefferson's case, built their lives on the backs of enslaved people. Their stories remind us that even the greatest leaders are still human, flawed, complicated, and sometimes hypocritical. What they built was extraordinary, but the truth behind their lives is just as important as the ideals they wrote down. When we picture the founding fathers, we often think of them as heroes carved in stone, serious, noble, and wise. But the real men behind the legends were far more complicated. They had private fears, emotional struggles, secret relationships, and moral contradictions. Some even tried to hide their personal stories from history. But time has a way of revealing the truth. Let's begin with George Washington, the first president and father of the nation. Washington seemed calm and fearless in public, but he had many private doubts. Before taking command of the Continental Army, he worried that he wasn't good enough to lead. He told others he lacked experience and asked for only his expenses to be paid, so he wouldn't look power-hungry. This gave the impression of humility, but it also helped him avoid criticism. He was obsessed with his public image. Washington destroyed many of his personal letters, including romantic ones to Sally Fairfax, a woman he admired before marrying Martha. Their marriage was stable, but not very romantic. Most of their letters were formal, and after his death, Martha burned nearly all of them, possibly to protect their privacy or hide emotional truths. Though Washington is remembered for self-control, he had a dangerous temper. His aides described moments of rage, especially during battles. He once threw his hat to the ground and cursed so loudly that soldiers froze in place. He worked hard to appear calm, but privately, the stress often boiled over. Washington also owned hundreds of enslaved people. He claimed to be uncomfortable with slavery and freed some of them in his will, but during his lifetime, he used legal tricks to keep enslaved workers from becoming free. In Pennsylvania, which had a law that freed enslaved people after 6 months, Washington rotated them out of the state before they reached that deadline. He believed in freedom, but not for everyone. Now, let's talk about John Adams, the second president. Adams had one of the most tender and honest relationships of any founding father. His letters to his wife, Abigail Adams, are full of deep emotion. They wrote over 1,100 letters to each other. Abigail didn't just support John emotionally, she gave him political advice. She once asked him to remember the ladies when writing new laws for the nation. He didn't. No one did. But she tried. Adams was brilliant, but often grumpy and jealous. He worried that history would forget him. He disliked how much praise George Washington and Benjamin Franklin received. After leaving office, he wrote bitter letters full of resentment. He also fought with many of his fellow leaders, including Jefferson and Hamilton. Still, Adams was the only major founding father who refused to own slaves, even when it made life harder for him. He believed slavery was wrong, and he lived by that principle, even when others did not. James Madison, the fourth president, was quiet and sickly. He was small, just over 5 feet tall, and suffered from health problems his entire life. Many believe he had epilepsy. He was so sure he would die young that he never wrote a memoir, but he outlived many of his peers. Madison helped write the Constitution and many of the Federalist Papers. He was the brains behind America's system of government, but he preferred to work behind the scenes. His wife, Dolly Madison, was his opposite: fun, charming, and outgoing. She helped make their home the social center of Washington, D.C., serving ice cream and hosting fancy dinners. Together, they made a powerful team. Madison spoke against slavery in private letters, but he still owned enslaved people and did little to fight the system. He believed in limited government and individual rights, but he failed to apply those beliefs to the enslaved men and women who served him. Another forgotten figure is Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, a pamphlet that helped convince Americans to fight for independence. Paine was bold, honest, and not afraid to challenge authority. But after the American Revolution, he went to France and supported their revolution too. There, he barely escaped execution during the Reign of Terror. Paine later wrote The Age of Reason, which criticized organized religion. That made him unpopular in both Europe and America. When he returned to the US, he was mocked, shunned, and left to die in poverty. Only 6 people came to his funeral. He had helped spark a revolution, but his radical ideas made him a forgotten outsider. And then there was Gouverneur Morris, the man who actually wrote the final words of the Constitution, including the famous line, "We the people." He was smart, bold, and totally unfiltered. He walked with a wooden leg, which some said he lost jumping from a jealous husband's window during an affair. Morris had many lovers, broke social rules, and eventually married a woman involved in a scandal. Even his death was bizarre. He reportedly tried to treat a medical problem himself using a whalebone and died from the injury. He lived and died on his own terms, full of flair and risk. Together, these stories show us something important. The founding fathers were human. They had big dreams, but also big flaws. They spoke of freedom, but often owned slaves. They wrote about honor while hiding affairs. They helped build a democracy, but sometimes acted like kings in private. This doesn't mean their achievements don't matter. They built a country that still stands today. But their personal lives remind us that history is never simple. It's made by real people with all their strengths, weaknesses, secrets, and contradictions.